All right, well, hello everyone. I'm going to work us through our first of these tablet-based little lectures. So I have this fun new toy in my office of a computer sketch pad. I can draw things and voiceover, obviously, and give you some tips on, in this case, how to think about and how to manipulate some supply and demand diagrams. So you've been reading about supply and demand in Colander for the last couple of days, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to deal with these graphs. So Colander gives you a good background on where supply and demand comes from, what it means, what it represents, and all of that. What I want to talk with you a little bit about today is why there's this difference that he points out between shifts of supply and demand curves versus movements along supply and demand curves. And the terminology is one of those things where it's not different enough to really be noticeable sometimes. And so I just kind of wanted to walk you through the process. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about supply and demand, and in particular about the shifters in supply and demand. So what's important to remember is that when we draw a supply and demand diagram, well, it doesn't have to be that curvy, but that's the way it goes, I guess. We always have to remember to label the axes. So supply and demand curves are drawn in price quantity space. So price is up here on the vertical axis. I'm just going to abbreviate that as P for price. Quantity of the good down here is denoted by this Q. So if we take, for example, a demand curve, which is downward sloping, we'll label it with a D, being very clever with our labels. So demand, and it shows an inverse relationship between price and quantity. High prices correspond to low quantity demanded, and low prices, right, meaning that we're down sort of in the lower part of the graph here, correspond to high quantity demanded, right? We're out further to the right. So that's what the inverse relationship, or that negative slope of this demand line, tells us. Now, what's important to remember is that in building the demand curve, Colander lets us know that there are a whole bunch of things that determine demand, or determine quantity demanded. And of those things, we only represent one of them, price, in the diagram. This is a little bit of an artifact of having to draw pictures in 2 dimensions, which I suppose with a computer we could maybe draw in 3. If you can draw in 4, you have a special talent and you probably should pursue it. It's maybe possible to think about things more multi-dimensionally than that, but it gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. So in order to stick to something that we can draw nicely on a flat piece of paper, on a flat computer screen, we draw in 2 dimensions. So we have price and quantity as the 2 dimensions, even though demand itself is really probably a 5 or 6 or 7 dimensional concept, maybe even more than that. And so we break up the things that determine quantity demanded, that determine demand, into a list that involves price, first of all, and then demand shifters. Right? And these demand shifters, the ones that Colander lists off for us, include income, they include tastes and preferences, prices of other goods, and things like that. So let's just jot those things down. So we have income, we have prices of other goods. These are going to be substitutes or complements. And number 3, other things that are on this list. Oh, it's a poor job of an F. Let's correct that. There we go. Other things on this list. 3, tastes and preferences. Just how much do you like or dislike a particular good or service. So tastes and preferences. We have expectations on the list. And finally, number 5, taxes and subsidies, things that the government might do to us or for us. So all of those things, all these things on this list influence demand. But the key is that they don't all influence the demand diagram the same way. So they're all important. We don't want to suggest that they're not important, but we've kind of elevated price by including it here in the picture. We've elevated price to kind of a special spot. So if we have a change in price, get the terminology down here, then the demand curve that I've drawn here up above is perfectly fine to help us understand a change in price. So for example, if the price starts off at $4 and at $4 demand is maybe 500 units of the good, and the price falls to $2, and when the price falls to $2, then a few more dots there, then the quantity goes up to, say, I don't know, maybe 1,100 units of the good. That all can be handled with this existing demand curve because all that we've done is we've changed the price, right? It's fallen in this case, and that means that quantity demanded has increased. We basically are just sliding along this existing demand curve. So I sometimes will draw this with some little arrows here on the demand curve itself to show the movement as we slide down this thing from our initial starting point way up here to our new point down here, something like that. So that change in price, we're going to use the term a change. Let me grip my pen a little bit better there. Change in quantity demanded. And we're going to say that that's going to be different than a change that we'll see here in a moment in demand itself. So a change in quantity demanded, and the important thing graphically is that this change in quantity demanded is represented by a movement along the existing demand curve. Now the alternative would be if one of these other things up here changes, income, price of other goods, taste and preferences, and so on. If one of those things changes, then we're going to need to relocate the entire demand curve. And if we do that, then we'll show it as a shift. All right, so let's come down here and let's make a note of that. Let's say change what should we say? We'll just say change in anything else. Not literally anything else, but anything else that affects demand, and that list of demand shifters up to the right here is what we have in mind. A change in anything else is going to be a change in demand itself, and it's going to be represented by a shift in the demand curve. So a shift versus a movement is really just another shorthanded way of talking about changes in demand versus changes in quantity demanded. That's the place where the terminology is really not all that different, but it means something very, very different. And the shift or the change in demand is brought about by a change in one of the demand shifters, one of these anything else items. And a movement, as a change in quantity demanded, is brought about only by a change in price. That's the only thing that can move us along an existing demand curve. So let's talk about some of these shifts, and then we'll be able to say some of the same things about supply. So let's get a new color here. Let's switch over to red. If suppose that income goes up, suppose we know that income is going to increase, and suppose that the good in question is what we call a normal good. And a normal good is one that responds when income goes up, that people buy more of it. The alternative is what's called an inferior good. An inferior good is one that has the opposite relationship. Income goes up and you actually buy less of it. And normal goods are, well, they're normal, so most things fall in that category. It's easier to think of specific examples of inferior goods. One of my favorite examples is Top Ramen, because of course, while there may be the strange person who can't wait until they're a millionaire and they can stock their kitchen shelves from floor to ceiling with Top Ramen, for most of us this is something that we buy and consume because it's cheap. And once our income goes up, we don't buy and consume as much of it. So that would meet the definition of an inferior good. But for our purposes here, let's talk about normal goods. So maybe we're talking about the demand for pizza again. And when income goes up, we would expect to see the demand for pizza would increase. So I'm going to draw this red demand curve, call it D prime. I'm going to shift or show the shifting of the curve with these arrows moving this thing to the right. Now it's important to remember that quantity is what's being measured on the horizontal axis, and so increases and decreases in quantity demanded, in demand itself in this case because we're shifting the whole curve, are represented by left-right movements. So when we say that demand increases, we mean that it shifts to the right as opposed to shifting up. And that would be true for a change in income. For a normal good, if income goes up, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. Other things that could shift this, let's taste and preferences, for example. Suppose there's a news article that says that pizza has magical cancer-fighting properties. Wouldn't that be wonderful if that were true? In that case, that news article itself would likely change people's tastes and preferences and result in this kind of shift to the right for pizza. That is to say, at all prices, right? So at $4, at $3, at $2, at all of these prices, quantity demanded is higher than it was before. That's what a shift looks like. I'm going to take a moment to pause the video here and clear off the screen and talk a little bit about supply, and then we will be all finished. Just a couple more things to talk about. I'd like to quickly run through the same conversation that we did for demand, but do it on the supply side, and then kind of close by showing you why all this matters. So we're going to talk for just a few minutes now about supply. Oh, maybe I should switch back to black just for consistency's sake. Not blue, black. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about supply. The supply curve is positively sloped. That is, it has an upward positive relationship between quantity down here on the horizontal axis and price up on the vertical axis. So here's an example of a supply curve. The relationship between price and quantity, as with demand, is kind of a special one. If we have an increase in price, we slide up the supply curve. We call that a change in quantity supplied, or a movement along the existing supply curve. And if we have a change in some other things, then we can see a shift in supply. And just to refresh your memory from Colander, the items that he lists off as being important for supply, and this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but the things that he lists off are input prices, technology, expectations again, and as with demand, government stuff, taxes and subsidies. So changes in these other variables can influence and change and shift the supply curve, right? So these are the supply shifters that we might see. So just to give you a specific example and show you how it's going to look in the picture here, if we, actually let's go something different. If we saw a change in technology, let's say, so suppose that we're still talking about pizza, only now we're thinking about the supply side. Suppose someone invents a new piece of machinery that allows you to crank out twice as many pizzas in the same period of time using all the other same inputs. That's going to result in an improvement and an increase in supply, not an increase in quantity supplied, not just sliding around the existing supply curve, but this supply curve is effectively gone. I could even scribble it out if I want to. I'll leave it here as a sort of reference point. The new supply curve, after this change in technology, this improvement in technology, we'll call S prime, and it is a shift to the right of the existing supply curve. And that's really crucial. Even more important here to remember that we're talking about changes in quantity. So these are left-right shifts that we need to pay attention to. So a change in supply is a shift to the right, an increase in supply is a shift to the right, a decrease in supply is a shift to the left. Now all of this is going to be important. Let me clear a couple of these things out. Let me back up a little bit and get a clear slate. But all these things are going to be important when we add in some information about demand. So let's go back. So now we're going to draw in both. We have a market. We know that there's some equilibrium value. Let's suppose that the market for pizza is currently in equilibrium at $3 with 1,000 slices of pizza trading hands. If we have that same change in technology, so suppose that there's this technological improvement and we see an increase in supply because of this improvement in technology. So the supply curve shifts out to the right. What we know is going to happen is that we're going to have some new equilibrium, right? So there's new equilibrium value right here. Originally we were here at $3 and 1,000, $3 and 1,000 units. What happens because of this change in technology, and this is what you read about comparative static analysis, right? These kinds of applications and changes, is that suppose the price of pizza now might fall to $2.50, and at the same time we might end up with something like 1,300 slices of pizza trading hands. So that increase in supply has in turn brought about, you can see this movement along the demand curve, a change in quantity demanded to meet this new supply, and the net result is that we see a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. So hopefully all of that gives you some sense of how these curves are constructed, what they mean, and most importantly, how these shifters affect both the supply and demand curves. That's all for now. Take care.